Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Cosmic Bridge podcast. If this is your first time listening, my name is Michael Hanson and I'm the host. Typically, we have guests. Occasionally, I do a solo podcast, and today is going to be one of those days. So, the thing I'm going to be discussing today is the fact that I write to someone on death row in the USA. And also my podcast producer who will be listening to this, Tom Jenkins, also does the same. So you may be thinking, why would two British guys be writing to someone in death row? So I'm going to be explaining that. I'm also going to be talking about the psychology behind it and some things related to what Carl Jung would call the shadow and just the overall process. And if anyone's interested by the end of the podcast in doing it, in the show notes, we'll put some information about the group. So the group is called Human Rights, and that's not rights as in how you would normally spell human rights. It's rights as in writing. So WRITES. And they're an amazing group which facilitates people in the UK to write to people on death row in the US. And it's very common that these people actually have pen friends. So the reason I decided to do this podcast is last weekend, I went to the Human Rights Conference here in London, in the UK, which was phenomenal and really inspiring. And I'll be talking about some of that today. So let's take a step back. Why did I first start and how did I start, right? So I actually heard about human rights from an Ethiopian friend, funnily enough, whose dad was a political prisoner in Ethiopia, and actually wrote a short story, which I read, comparing his time in an Ethiopian prison to death row, because he'd actually joined human rights and was writing to someone on death row who unfortunately then got executed, and he was very upset about it. So I read this short story. I found it quite touching. And then after that, and also I'd worked in African politics and seen some of the things that can happen in terms of like political imprisonment. So anyway, I found this story very touching. And then later on, about a week after I finished reading this story, I was reading this thing called The Big Issue, which is a magazine that homeless people sell in the UK. It's a way of homeless people earning money, and they take a cut of the magazine. But in that magazine, I saw an advert for human rights. And as you'll all know from this podcast, if you listen to it, I saw this as a bit of what Jung would call synchronicity, where the world is almost sending you a message saying, hey, you got to do this, right? So I thought, wow, last week I had this story, never heard about it before. And suddenly now I'm getting an advert in the paper or this magazine that I was reading about human rights. And I did think it was very interesting when I heard about it, but wasn't like, hey, I want to do this myself. But then I saw an advert, looked on the website and wrote a message and thought, hey, I'm going to apply. Now, what happens is after you apply, which is very wise, they prepare you psychologically and say, hey, this is a big thing mentally to prepare yourself for, because you're going to get in someone's like mental space. You're going to start a relationship with someone who may have committed a heinous crime, right? And that was really good advice. And the other thing they said to us was, after we assign you an inmate, don't Google the person straight away. We recommend waiting 3 or 4 months. You've exchanged quite a few letters with them to actually Google the person and what their crime is. Alleged crime it could be, as some people on death row have been proven to be innocent, which I'll talk about later. So anyway, I did that, which I thought was really good advice. And it means you don't judge the person from the start. You're just judging them based on the letters that are being sent. In terms of how you send the letters, you can send handwritten letters, or I actually do it through an electronic system, which is like an email. You're only allowed to share certain things on the email. So in prison, you don't have access to a lot of things like social media. Kind of there's restrictions like there is in places like China. So they can only view certain things on the internet, and any attachment that you send is going to be reviewed the same way the post is reviewed if you send them a normal letter. So yeah, I started writing to an inmate. And just before we talk about that experience, you may be wondering, why is this guy doing this? Because I've explained this to some friends, to people in my line of work before, and they were like, why would you do that? Why would you write to a criminal, essentially, right? Jung and a lot of modern psychologists who studied Jung, what they talk about is think about the worst possible crime, right? So if we think about something like the Holocaust, right, and what the Nazis did to Jewish people, non-Aryan people, often we think of being the victim in that situation, right? Being the person who is being persecuted. But the reality is that in Germany at that time, most people went along with it. Most people were guards. Most people voted for the Nazis. People went along with the system. So actually, what Jung talks about, imagine being the worst possible person you could be and think, why would you end up like that? And then this creates some type of sympathy. Oh, if I was abused as a kid, if I went through this, and, you know, I've been very fortunate in my life that I've had a solid family, had good parents, had a good upbringing. I'm fortunate with my work. So I have a lot of gratitude in that sense. And I know it's not like that for everyone. The person I write to did murder someone. I didn't learn about what exactly he'd done until about 3 months after I Googled him. But essentially, he murdered someone while he was trying to do a robbery. And what I'd found out after writing to him is that he had children at a very young age. He had a gambling addiction. And then through that, he obviously needed to get money. So he ended up doing this robbery and someone was in the middle. And obviously, that person's life was taken. I personally do not believe in a death penalty, but I certainly believe that this person deserved to do many years' life in prison. But I can also imagine myself in that situation, going back to the shadow and thinking about myself. If I had a very young family, I was trying to make money for them in my normal job, it wasn't going well. Maybe I'm going to do gambling. I'm young, I'm naive. I think gambling is a way to do that. That doesn't go well. And then I'm like, okay, how can I go and get money? And this person is not from a good economic background as well. So you start to get into the psychology of why would someone do something like this. The other part of it, and this may sound a bit selfish, is when I write to my guy on death row, obviously I'm going to keep his name confidential as well. I'm not revealing too many details of the crime as well. It gives me a lot of gratitude for life. Sometimes I'm having quite a bad day. I'm stressed with work, family issues. You know, we all go through our different things. Every single person has problems as they face, especially as you get older, right? And you have more responsibility and you have people relying on you. But yeah, we have our daily stresses, and sometimes I have my daily stresses and I write to the guy and hear what he's doing and even think about him just for 1 second and think, wow, I'm so lucky. I'm so lucky the amount of freedom that I have in my life. So it gives me a lot of gratitude as well, just to think of, imagine having to eat prison food, which is horrible, every day, being locked up in four walls, right? Obviously, you're with the same sex all the time as well. So I know that's one of the things my guy talks about. He often asks me to send him photos of women because he's not around women, right? And he misses that aspect of life. And the system that I use to send him photographs, it will not allow X-rated photographs. They're just normal pictures of women, but he just wants to see any pictures of women because on death row, there are no women, right? So yeah, imagine that. It's a very difficult situation that he's in. And writing to this guy, he's actually very profound. He writes, I find him very interesting as well. It's not just an altruistic thing. I enjoy writing to him because he is very funny. He's very philosophical. I imagine just staring at four walls all the time, being incarcerated, you probably have a lot of time to think about life. And then I think one of the things that is mad about death row is some people stay on death row for decades, right? And that's actually been this guy's case. Some people are executed quite quickly, and others, where there's appeals and these types of things, they're there for ages, not knowing if they're going to die in a week, 10 years, 20 years, which is pretty crazy. So I imagine that type of thing makes you very philosophical as well. So that's a bit about my own journey. What I wanted to talk about was this conference that I went to last week in London, which was really inspiring. So a few things that I wanted to talk about. So yeah, the first thing that was really interesting about this conference is there was maybe around 100 people there. If we're talking about the writers who are writing to people on death row. And I would say only about 5-10 people were my age or younger. Most of the people there were firstly women, and secondly were older, right? So over the age of 60. And I think this potentially shows two things. There's been a lot of psychological tests done by this, that women are more compassionate. And then in terms of the age thing, perhaps we get more compassionate as we get older. And I actually mentioned this to my dad, who's 81 or maybe 82. Not good, I forgot my dad's age there. And he was saying, yeah, obviously, as you get older, you have more sympathy with people because you've committed more mistakes yourself. And I definitely feel that. I think I was a lot more judgmental when I was younger. And as I get older, sometimes you look at people and you think, damn, they've screwed up there, but I screwed up in the exact same way before. And that goes to shadow. What I was talking about with Carl Jung's shadow is that as we get older, we understand our shadow a lot better. So when we see the shadow of someone else, we can start to think, oh, maybe that would have been me. Whereas when we're younger, we're very judgmental in those situations. And obviously that's not for everyone. There's some young people that are extremely wise and there's some old people that aren't. But what I found is this group, and I really felt, people say, find your tribe. I really felt like everyone else there really understood the shadow of the human psyche. And it was a really amazing group to be around. Everyone was super friendly and really enjoyed it. So if you are interested in joining Human Rights, as I said, it's WRITES. Google it, go on the website. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. And then this conference was amazing. I've been doing this for 2 years, but this is the first time I went to the conference and I really enjoyed it. And then getting on to the keynote speaker at the event. So yeah, the keynote speaker was a guy called Neal Moore, who was unbelievably inspiring. I had goosebumps listening to this guy. And essentially, his story sounded quite similar to the person I was talking about, who I write to. The difference with this guy, Billy, is he actually pleaded guilty. And I think he's one of the only people to ever get off death row who had pleaded guilty. A lot of people have been on death row. There's been multiple cases who didn't plead guilty, but it was found out eventually through new evidence that they were innocent, right? So that's why also a lot of people don't like the death penalty, because people have been executed and it's later been found out that they've been innocent. But with this guy, that wasn't the case. He actually pleaded guilty. So let me tell you about his crime. Essentially, this guy, again, he had children when he was very young. He had a daughter. He split up with the wife. He ended up taking the daughter, not taking the daughter, but had custody of the daughter, was living in a caravan, was trying to earn money, was struggling to earn money, trying to do lots of different jobs. So he started drug dealing. That didn't go well. So he decided he was going to rob this house, a friend of a friend, where he heard there was $30,000. Now, when he went to the house, he went with a gun, and the other person in the house also had a gun. So as he went into the house, the person in the house was defending himself and shot Billy in the leg. After he was shot in the leg, Billy reacted, shot the person, and did eventually take the money, which wasn't actually $30,000. He said it was about $5,000. Now, interestingly, what happened is Billy felt very guilty for this. Because of that, he pleaded guilty to the murder. And typically in these instances, it wouldn't always result in a death penalty, but for Billy, it did, unfortunately. And Billy spent decades on death row after this. Now, the thing that I really like about this story is Billy was someone with a big conscience, and he actually decided to write to 30 members of the victim's family of the person that he killed, saying that he was extremely sorry and that he didn't expect them to forgive him, but if they could forgive him, obviously he would appreciate it. Wrote really from the bottom of his heart. And what's mad is all 30 members of the family, they all wrote to him and said they forgave him. Now, what was then interesting was Billy said, how can you forgive me? I don't understand. Like, after what I've done, probably thinking, if I was in your shoes, I don't know if I could forgive myself here. And they said, the reason we forgive you is we don't want to hold on to this resentment. We don't want to have this resentment because it's also bad for us, right? It's not just for you. So we're doing this so we can move on ourselves. Anyway, after this, while he was in prison, a bishop actually visited Billy as well and ended up baptizing him on the spot, converted Billy. Billy described his conversion to Christianity as he just felt something about this guy, that he felt this person was genuine. And I think we've all been around people like that, whether they're Christians or not. There's something almost holy. They have this energy about them. So he converted to Christianity through that. And then going back to the victim's family, what was interesting about them, some of them developed a relationship with Billy, right? So some of the sisters of the victim, again, going to the women being very compassionate, and the mother. What happened is through this, they said, you've still not forgiven yourself. You're saying you're a Christian, you're saying you're into forgiveness, but you still haven't forgiven yourself. And eventually through his faith, he was able to start that journey of forgiving himself. So really incredible story of forgiveness, really inspiring. And I think especially the families, like for them to be able to do that, I was just so touched by this whole story. But going back to Billy's story, and the families are going to come back into this again later. So Billy was in death row for decades, as I said. And I think there was 5 or 6 times where they said he was going to be executed. And I think one of the last times it happened, they basically take you to this spot before, in the 3 days before, called Death Watch, right? Which is you actually stay in a different place for 3 days before you're going to get executed. And they gather the family and anyone else that's going to come. Now, while he was in Death Watch, for a week before he started fasting, obviously at this point he's religious, so through a kind of spiritual experience before his death. And while he was fasting on Death Watch, he got this message from God saying, this isn't your time. You're not going to die. And he then realized after speaking to the guards that he could speak to his lawyer during that time. So he decided to call his lawyer, who was also a very spiritual and religious person, but was a Jewish person. And so he could relate to Billy's kind of faith here, and spoke to the judge and spoke to people in the system. And they said, what are you talking about? It doesn't matter if he's got a message from God. The law's the law. He's got to be executed. And anyway, I don't know the exact details. Billy didn't explain them that well, but he was able to not be executed while he was on Death Watch, and he returned to the prison. Through that, he was then eventually, he never went on Death Watch again, never got a date again, and he was actually able to get a case back in court. And what was crazy is, in that case, I talked about the 30 members of the family. Some of those members of the victim's family then went to court and said to the court, the legal system in the US, that Billy should not be on death row. Obviously, Billy should pay for what he did to their relative, but he should have a life sentence. And during that, thanks to the family, so that family's incredible forgiveness and wanting to get rid of the resentment and that hate in their heart, he was then transferred from death row to a life sentence. And that meant he did a certain number of years and eventually got out. So I think it was 25 years that he did. And then he got out. So now Billy is free. He was able to fly to the UK and speak at this event, and truly inspiring guy. We're going to put links to his book and his profile in the show notes if you want to hear more about his story. So anyway, that was an incredible story, I thought, from Billy. Obviously, I mentioned my story about the guy I'm writing to. That's all confidential, so I can't tell you his name or anything like that. But as I said, if you are interested in joining human rights, I really recommend the experience. It's not for everyone. It's quite a heavy experience getting into these things, but it is really fascinating. So yeah, and if you want someone to talk to you personally, feel free to reach out to me on my LinkedIn or my email, and happy to run through what it's like. And yeah, if you think there's anyone in your network who's a bit crazy like me and would do this type of thing, then feel free to share this podcast with them, share the YouTube link. And as always, if you found value in this, please subscribe to us. Please get your friends to subscribe. Most of the listeners that listen to the show are not subscribers. So as always, welcome a subscription so we can spread the word about great things like human rights. And we'll see you next week on the next episode of The Cosmic Bridge. Cheers.